Welcome to the Future of Learning, where innovation meets education.
Hello, today we're here with Emma Nahna, a literacy specialist from South Foundation for Literacy. Before we get started, I just want to mention that in today's episode, if you are watching it either on YouTube or Spotify, there's going to be some really cool links that Emma will share with us. So make sure you tune in and have a look at the video episode. Welcome, Emma. Thank you for joining us.
Thank you very much for inviting me onto your new exciting podcast. Lovely to be here with you.
No worries. So, Emma, do you want to explain to us and explain to the audience a little bit about what being a literacy specialist entails and what your role is?
Sure. I have a background in speech and language therapy, or speech pathology if you are in Australia. So I trained in that in Australia, although I am a Kiwi. So for both of those audiences, kia ora and hello. And I don't do clinical work in speech language therapy anymore. So I've always had a really strong interest in literacy development, how preschool language development feeds into the development of literacy, and then particularly in how people learn to read and spell and write and understand what they read. And particularly in the last sort of 5 to 10 years, really developed a passion for learning more about and making a difference in how children acquire literacy because of its role in exacerbating inequities in learning and in life. So I have a really strong passion for this area because I think it's just so extremely important. So over the last 10 years, I increasingly was running courses and professional learning for teachers and parents, but really now all I do is work with schools. I often work with them for a year, 2 years or 3 years and help them learn about evidence-based practices, learn about how reading and spelling develop, and then the most high impact things that we can do to make sure that happens for all of our kids. And I really love that work because I feel like I'm impacting on hundreds and even maybe thousands of children all at the same time.
That's great. Thank you for that. And can you explain to us what structured literacy is?
Okay. I'm really glad you asked this one up front because I think it's just a nice opportunity to have another go at helping all our listeners and all of our teachers, kaiako, understand the depth of what structured literacy means, because it's a term that's used increasingly often, especially in New Zealand at the moment. And there's words from our new government about structured literacy being rolled out as a mandatory way of teaching, which I support. But what is sad is that there's quite a misconception about what that really means. And I think for a lot of people, when they hear structured literacy, they might think of just teaching phonics on steroids with the exclusion of everything else, especially to the exclusion of joyful reading to and with and by children, which is not the case at all. But what it really is, it is an umbrella term which describes evidence-informed teaching of all aspects of literacy, so speaking, listening, reading and writing. It's a term that was defined by the International Dyslexia Association in 2016, but that's recently been updated to really try and express the breadth and depth of what this term really encompasses in terms of all of those important aspects that go into speaking, listening, reading and writing, and therefore all of the different aspects that we can focus on for assessment and for teaching to make sure that all of our learners cross the bridge. And that's a term that Professor Pamela Snow uses. She talks about all of our kids crossing the bridge to literacy and getting safely to the other side. We don't want any of our kids falling in the river on the way. And too many of our children are not crossing the bridge and making it. So it's a really comprehensive term, and each component of that is informed by solid scientific research from all around the world over many, many decades, looking at how that component develops and what can go wrong and what might be the most effective way to teach that component to make sure our kids get across that bridge to reading and writing. So I'm going to share a graphic. Just bear with me a moment, get that going. Here we go. Right, so I wanted to share, okay, this is the one I wanted to share first. This is the one that comes from the International Dyslexia Association. And this is their updated graphic, which just came out in 2023. So this one shows it's an approach to teaching, so it's not a program. Structured literacy teaching is going to involve lots and lots of different components to make a really comprehensive approach to teaching literacy within a classroom, within a school, and hopefully within a nation, of making sure that we really get to all of the important parts. So the instructor, the teacher, is at this top layer here, and we look at who does this kind of teaching apply to. So Tier 1 teaching is for all of our children. This is an American term, general education, but this is for all learners. What's really important, all of these parts are really important for all learners, but when we develop a really deep understanding of all of the parts, we know through assessment which children don't need us to teach all of the parts explicitly and systematically, or the ones who need us just to teach it once and they don't need a whole lot of practice. But many, many more children, I think, than we ever thought, really do need us to show them how all of these parts are built. We have a really complex language in English, and because of that, it really pays off well for us to actually make sure we teach all the parts. Tier 2 is for generally children who might need extra practice of our good, high-quality classroom teaching to enable that learning to stick. So they might need more opportunities to interact with the same learning. And then our Tier 3 students are going to need more intensive and more individualised teaching to ensure that they can pick up and hold on to that new learning and maybe reading, spelling and fluency, and to keep up and catch up to their peers. And we know that if we teach this way from the very start, from the very early days, we can prevent most literacy difficulties from happening, which is really exciting. And that would be a very different story to what we have at the moment, when we have 30, 40%, 50% in some cases of our children who are not meeting their age and grade expectations for reading and writing. So under this structured literacy infographic, we've got the what. So what do we teach? And we've got all these components, and I'm not going to go through every single one, but we can see that if we were just thinking about phonics, it would be phonemes and graphemes, just in this one little tiny box here. That would be the only thing that phonics really covers. Whereas structured literacy is all about all of these parts. So we've got word recognition, handwriting, and spelling. So those are two sides of the same coin, decoding and encoding. So written language is a code. It is a collection of symbols. Our letters are just symbols. They could be any shape, but they are used to write down the words that we say in a code. And we have to learn to crack that code to get those words off the page and turn them back into spoken language. So, and we need to be able to, that's decoding, and we need to be able to encode spoken language to take our spoken words, put them into symbols or code and get them into writing. So we've got two sides of that same coin, decoding and encoding, reading and spelling words. But there's all these other parts that we can assess and teach in structured literacy. And then the other half of that is comprehension, so reading comprehension and writing composition. And to be able to do that, we need all these big buckets of knowledge, so lots of vocabulary and background knowledge, understanding and the ability to compose or use increasingly sophisticated sentence structures that go far beyond the sort of sentences that we use in talking. So sentences that we find in written text or that we create in written text are much more complex than our everyday talk. Learning all about different increasingly sophisticated text structures. So moving from picture books to early chapter books to novels to scientific articles and primary sources for history, writing a science report or writing a persuasive argument. All of these different parts, they all come under structured literacy. But there's also this how. So we've got what do we teach? And then this other half here is how do we teach it? And this is informed by a body of research called the science of learning. And that applies to anything that humans need to learn that's new for us. and that we don't develop just naturally because we're programmed to do that. So we are sort of hardwired to acquire a whole lot of typical human skills, like rolling over and sitting up and crawling and walking and reading people's faces and responding and learning how to talk. But anything that humans have invented, we do better learning it if somebody shows us how to do it and then they give us some coaching. So that is things like playing a musical instrument, driving a car, and reading and spelling. We don't have a special brain area that's developed over thousands, millions of years to become a reader and speller. It's just not present. We have to build a network of neurons in the brain that can do that job. So this is where the science of learning comes in, is what's the most effective ways that we can help humans learn new skills. And this would apply whether you were learning tennis or piano or reading and spelling. So we've got this explicit teaching, which in itself covers a whole range of instructional techniques. So high rate, fast pace, lots of teacher modeling, lots of student participation, checking for understanding frequently. So it's a whole pedagogy and a way of teaching all sorts of new skills. We want to sequence new learning in a way that makes sense, that goes from simple to complex. We want to be always bringing in review and practice of things we've already taught to make sure that new learning goes into long-term memory. And then we've got down the bottom here the why, which is that huge science base that I was talking about that informs why would a teacher make it, what informs our decision making on a day-to-day basis. So why would we choose to use a certain assessment tool at a certain point of a child's development and literacy, or why would we choose to focus on a certain skill in the what, or why would we choose to use a certain instructional technique at a different part of learning development. Okay, so the second part of that graphic.
Yes.
Yeah?
No, continue. I'll wait and then I'll ask afterwards.
Okay, cool. I'm going to zoom in on this central part here, which is putting the learner at the center of all of this learning. And it gives us the why. Why should we expend the energy to learn all of this new terminology and these new practices and techniques and put them into practice? It's because of our kids who are put at the center here. So this puts the what, the content of what we teach, the how of how we teach it, and then all of these different parts it's just a rearrangement of the information on that previous graphic, but it's just putting the most important person in the middle there, that all of those decisions are to accelerate and ensure that all of our kids get across that bridge to literacy because of its importance to life outcomes and because of learning outcomes. And, research has shown how tightly linked literacy achievement and learning achievement at school is to mental health outcomes, employment outcomes, involvement in the justice system later in life. So we need to get this right from 5 years of age. And we need to know that it's more than just phonics on steroids.
Thank you so much, Emma, for sharing that. I think that gives a very clear understanding as to what structural literacy is. And to me, it's so obvious as well that we will teach any other skill. Let's say how to, if a kid wanted to play sport, like you will teach them that skill, like you will break it down to the most basic thing that they need to do to be able to perform that skill. So it only makes sense that we do the same for something like reading, like let's break it down to the simplest component. So then we make it accessible for every single child who's trying to look at a text and it's like, what is this? So yeah, I think it's wonderful. So you mentioned earlier that the term structural literacy is in New Zealand been thrown around quite a bit at the moment. So for someone who's thinking, should I go into a structural literacy program or not? Can you again highlight all the benefits of perhaps going into structural literacy?
So I think one of the key things for me comes back to equity that I mentioned earlier. It just teaching this way, we really draw on what the evidence tells us is going to be most effective for most children. There's no magic fix. This is hard work that takes a long, long time to learn and put into action. It's not a silver bullet, but and the research is not going to tell us this is going to work for everybody, any particular strategy or teaching component. But it's a statistics game. It's a game of probability, and we need to be informed by what large studies, high quality empirical research is going to tell us, is going to give us our best bet of getting most children across that bridge. Because at the moment, especially in New Zealand, the way we've been teaching literacy over the last particularly 3 decades is not getting our learners across that bridge. We've got 30, 40, 50% in many cases where they're not getting there. We've had a lot of data come out over the last few years looking at, our 15-year-olds in some deciles, which was our previous version of looking at local socioeconomic status. In some deciles, if you were in a low decile school, so that's high levels of poverty, high levels of risk and vulnerability, 3% of those students in high school met their age expectations for writing. And I just found that sickening.
That is so low.
It was higher in higher decile schools, and that shouldn't be the case. Your postcode or your area where you live it doesn't determine your capacity to learn. And so teaching using structured literacy, I think it addresses unconscious bias that we might have. It enables us to have high expectations, because when you learn about reading and writing development and how to best get kids there, you know what to expect, and you know how to accelerate and prevent those prevent the difficulties that children might have. So it's beneficial, particularly for children who are more at risk, but it's also beneficial for us to have as teachers the knowledge of all of those parts of that make up speaking, listening, reading, and writing, so that we can accelerate and extend those kids who are making it through in high flyers and who can move at a faster pace. So learning about structured literacy involves this huge increase in teachers' knowledge and practice, and that comprehensive shift will take several years. We've got to be in it for the long game. I kind of worry that, if we, as a nation, if this goes ahead and we offer, a couple of day workshop on teaching a bit of phonics, that schools and particularly teachers will be left feeling very unsupported. They won't have enough knowledge, that they really need to feel capable and confident in teaching all of those parts of literacy. They'll give it a crack. It won't make an impact, and everybody will say, been there, tried that, structured literacy doesn't work. So we need to make sure that people are given the space.
Way too often in teaching, doesn't it?
It does, and teachers are overloaded.
And the time.
Yeah, they're overloaded with change and PD and new things all the time. And there's the other one you hear is, it's another pendulum shift. I've been around for decades, and this is just another swing, and we'll be back to how we did it before.
I have a question based on...
Yeah, sorry.
A couple of things based on what you've just said. So I think it would be, if you could give a snippet as to what has been done over the past 30 years to teach literacy and why we need to move away, because this, like you said earlier, data doesn't lie. And if there's one thing that we know is that what we have done hasn't worked. So what have we done so we can stop making those mistakes? Let's try to give this a go and stick to it. So perhaps for the listeners, especially for those who are not teachers, how is reading or literacy taught in the classrooms? And, well, we know what structural literacy is now thanks to you, but how do we move forward? So,
yeah, that's a great question. So first to that, I want to say that we can't be blaming and shaming our teachers who work extremely hard to get every child in their classroom to move forward in their learning. But many of us have been using techniques that we were taught through our initial teacher education and through our national literacy guidelines, which have worked for many children. So I think the feeling of someone coming along and saying, well, hey, you need to switch to structured literacy because what you're doing is just all wrong and you're not teaching children well. That's just not the case. Our teachers have taught hundreds and thousands of children to read and write, and that kind of teaching has worked for many, but it hasn't worked for enough. And we're seeing that it's less and less effective for more and more children. Maybe our children, maybe things have changed a little, and our children need a different approach. So we need to look at that. And if there's Alison Clark from Spelfabet has said before, if our school cafeteria was serving meals that made 30% of our children sick, there'd be an uproar, and we would take that food item off the menu and we would replace it with something healthy and nutritious immediately so that we weren't causing harm to any of our children. We would make sure that happened. And I guess that this is something like that. So some of the things that we know need to change are, so the approach that's been used really for 30 years is called balanced literacy. And the idea of balance is still really important. We need to have multiple components in our approach to teaching reading and writing and oral language. But the balance wasn't quite right before to get everybody there, and we need to take some things off the menu. So what was done before was we did teach some phonological awareness, and we definitely were teaching phonics. But the phonics would happen in its own little separate time of the reading and writing block. And then we go away to our guided reading groups. And guided reading groups would be based around the level of book that a child was assessed to be using a running record. And children would work through books where they could use the very first books would be teaching them to match the words that they're saying one-to-one with the words on the page. And these very early books, the very beginning levels, would be predictable. So it enabled the children to sort of figure out what the words on the page were without them yet having the skills to have cracked the code and read the words off the page. So it would be something like, where is my shirt? Here it is. And once they had that little carrier sentence memorized, the next page would have a photograph of some socks, and it would say, where are my
Socks.
Here they are. And then there'd be a photograph of a hat, and it would say, where is my hat? Here it is. And most children would take that book home and they'd say to mum and dad, look, I can read now, and I can read it with my eyes closed, because they could go through the book and they'd memorize the sentence.
You just took me back to my childhood.
Yeah, it was definite flashbacks
right. And
for
so
me.
the theory
just
was,
look at the pictures and try to figure it out.
Yeah, the theory was that if we immerse children in reading to them, stacks and stacks of wonderful books, which we should absolutely still do. That's 110% still best practice in the home and in early childhood and in schools. In fact, we should be reading to kids right till they're teenagers. But the theory was if we read to them lots and we gave them experiences of reading like this, that they would develop those reading skills. Comparing it to acquiring spoken language, that if you're surrounded by communication, you'll develop it. But that was not understanding that biologically primary and secondary nature of those kinds of learning. So one you do develop naturally, and the other one you need to be taught. So using predictable books at those very early stages is something we need to de-implement. That's not, although children sounded like they were reading and reading fluently, it's actually better if we can teach them a little bit of the alphabetic code, maybe 8 sounds to begin with, and teach them how to blend those to read words and segment them to spell words using just those 8 sounds. And then they can practice a little decodable book, which has no tricks, no surprises, so they can practice using those skills they've just learned. And we cumulatively grow that collection of phonemes and graphemes, or letters and sounds, that they can read and spell. We give them lots of practice use of reading and spelling words and sentences and little books with just those, and we grow it like a snowball over time. That's so much more developmentally appropriate. So the other thing that happened in those, so then we're taking our phonics lesson, and the practice that we're doing in our reading time with them, if we're pulling little small groups, is then actually reinforcing the learning that they've just had in phonics, instead of what happened then when we went to our guided reading groups with our leveled books. So after we got off those predictable stories, we would then have books with words that the children had no chance of actually reading. So it might have a word like shoulder, or actually one of my favourites that my son brought home early on was it was about a zoo safari, and it had buffalo and elephant, and he was about 5 and 3 weeks. And we taught children that to solve a word that they didn't know how to read, they could use some strategies, which would be to reread from the start of the sentence. So it might have been, I can see and then it might have been that predictable book that they could look at the photograph. But if he still didn't know some of those animals, I can see and he might see b, and you'd say, look at the first sound and look at the picture, and what word might that be? Instead of looking at all of the letters all the way through and figuring out how our written code works. Yeah, and the idea, I suppose, was that by seeing words and saying them at the same time lots and lots of times, that word and how it looked would be memorized so that they could read it in future. But we know now that actually the brain really needs to go through that very effortful stage of sounding out and blending to read the words, because connecting the speech sounds to the letters that represent them in sequence is actually how we store words for that effortless reading later. We've got to go through that really effortful, laborious phase to build the reading circuit.
Yeah, I was just thinking back, because English is my second language. So when I learned English, and up until now, because I didn't learn the structural literacy way, I remember as a grown-up having to do the guessing game. And I still do sometimes, because I still come across words that I haven't. I'm like, I think this is how you say it. I'm just going to give it a go. And then someone will correct me and we'll have a laugh because I'm Spanish. So they're like, yeah, haha, that's funny. But actually, I think it will also apply to everyone learning English as a second language. Absolutely. It will also apply to the same theory, right?
Yep. And so a lot of that research base looks at new language learners. So it's the research on how people develop reading and spelling is international, multiple languages, but also there's a body of it that looks at English language learners, because English is a particularly complicated language, as I'm sure you discovered. Spanish is a bit more regular and reliable in its spelling sound correspondences. And also English has borrowed vocabulary words from so many languages across geography and historical times. We've got multiple words for one thing. So we've got words that came from Latin. So if you think about water, we've got Latin and Greek versions of that also. So we've got hydra, which comes from Greek, and aqua, which comes from Latin. And we say water in English. Yeah. I can't remember which part of history that came from, but we've got these layers and layers and layers, and that brought different spelling patterns as well as words to mean similar things. So we've got a lot of nuance in the language, but there's a lot of words to learn. And actually you came up with something interesting there, Marcelo, with if you didn't have an idea of the spoken word in your vocabulary for an English word, when you come to decode the word that you see for the first time, it's harder. So new language learners need us to really boost up that vocabulary and sentence structure part of learning above and beyond what we already need to do for our native English speakers, because having those words in your spoken vocabulary, when you come across them in writing, it helps you flex the sounds and get to the right pronunciation. So if you didn't know the word stomach, a young child or a new language learner might sound it out stomach. But if you knew the word, you might say he had a sore stomach. Stomach. And they'd get it. They'd flex those sounds and get there. Yeah. So that's what kids need to do. They need to get to the point where they have enough knowledge of the alphabetic code to get close to the right pronunciation, and then they draw on their oral language, the sentence structure, and the context to pronounce it correctly, which is really different from the guessing game, where they look along. And some of the prompts for that, those giving the meaning, structure, and visual prompts are, reread and get your mouth ready to say the word. You can only get your mouth ready if you can actually sound out across the letters, and look at them and learning how that written code works. You've experienced it by trying to guess the words. You might learn that one word off by heart by how it looks. That gives you no tools to crack into other unfamiliar words in the future that are going to come up more and more as you get past year 4, 5, 6, and you get lots of maths and science words, or you get into Harry Potter and there's made up words. You need to be able to decode those symbols and get into long words using both your phonics knowledge and another layer, which is knowledge of morphemes. So that's the meaningful parts of words. So knowing how we spell meaningful parts of words consistently. So this is base words and prefixes and suffixes. So knowing that, ed on the end of a word means past tense helps, or knowing that re at the beginning is often pronounced re, or tion. Well, the actual suffix is ion, but knowing that sort of meaning-based chunk in a word will help you to crack into those bigger and bigger words as well. Now, back to that original question, was we're talking about the core benefits. Is that where we're going?
Yes.
Yes.
That's how we started this. And
okay.
Yep.
And I've ended up on morphology. So it's just such a huge increase in teachers' knowledge, because you've got to learn a huge amount of linguistics. You've got to learn about all these different layers of our language. It takes years, but what needs to those benefits, we need to use that knowledge to pick much better assessment tools. So we can identify those kids who really need our help really early, because we know if we do it early, we put in place the extra support and keep them caught up, don't let them fall behind, the gap just grows bigger and bigger. And if we leave it to about year 3 and 4, it will take 3 times as long, 3 times as much teaching resource and children's time out of class to actually try and fix the problem than if we did it early. We know it's most effective if teachers are receiving coaching support from experts and from colleagues in an ongoing way to help them make incremental changes and actually keep them up. And it just allows us to have that set of really highly effective instructional practices. We're learning new routines as teachers, and we need a chance to practice them and get feedback on it to improve our technique, just like if we were working on our tennis serve or a new skill, just like the children are learning skills of reading and spelling. Actually, I know what you asked me. You said, what were some of the things we were doing that we needed to stop? And I've got another one I need to say before we move on. So you said, so I was talking about those early readers. So we were doing phonics and then guided reading and leveled books. And we need to change that to have our early readers, unless they're already reading, they need to be using decodable books, especially in that first year where they're practicing the new alphabetic code knowledge we're teaching them. We need to stop using those cueing strategies, the guessing strategies, to prompt children to read words. We need to teach them that they can use their tools, their decoding tools, to read through words, because that guessing stuff is what poor readers do when they're struggling to read words. And when we ask children to guess at words like that, we are denying their brain the chance to get more input to their reading pattern processor in the brain and keep strengthening and building that reading network. We're skipping over it. So if they're not really working through a word, they need hundreds and hundreds of chances to practice those things. And if we prompt them to just look at the picture instead, we take their eyes straight off the letters, away from the print, we interrupt their thinking, and we interrupt that process. So we're really hindering them. So taking away that MSV cueing. What we do need to keep so teaching those decoding and encoding skills, those foundation skills of how the written code works. We need to keep this really strong focus on developing oral language through rich dialogic interactions with children. So a huge focus on teacher read aloud with interactive, structured discussions where children get to practice using new vocabulary words and talk about the content of what they're hearing, whether it's stories or informational text. Really good experiences with an adult and peer to discuss those with, to keep developing those oral language skills. Because once we get those words off the page, we're using our language system to understand what we've read. So nobody who's promoting structured literacy is talking about just teaching phonics. You can see all of those different components, and all of them need a heavy, really intentional, really explicit and systematic focus to produce children who can read and comprehend and create and compose written text and thoughtful response to what they're learning and express their learning in writing. It's all important. And I think that spelling instruction needs to continue right through all of the primary school years, right up to children are just about to head off to high school, really showing them, letting them explore their language and find out about all those layers of meaning, through morphology, and that really builds their vocabulary as well as their spelling. But as they move on up, that becomes a smaller and smaller part of the ingredient list of what goes into a really healthy, nutritious literacy approach. And we're focusing more on, increasingly complex sentence structures and text structures and reading more and more complex text and really building their reading fluency to support their comprehension. Better get on to the next question.
Yeah, that's great. That's really good. It actually segues quite nicely into the components part, where you're going to share a slide about the key components of structured literacy in an easy to digest way. And I know you've mentioned some of these already, but maybe just some detail around the different parts.
Fantastic. All right, so I'm going to do this quickly, and then I really want to give a real life example of what this might look like in a classroom, because I think people are starting to hear this messaging and think, okay, so there's something to this. Got to make sure we've got all these component parts, but how do I actually do it? Let's get in this graphic up to share. All right, so this is just a sort of rearranged version of these. What is structured literacy? And we've talked about the International Dyslexia Association infographic. So we've got that structure in terms of how we teach with those explicit instruction practices, and then the structures of what we teach, the structures of spoken and written language. And as teachers, we generally haven't had the opportunity to learn this stuff. So we've got all of these layers. Every language, spoken and written language, have these layers in them. And we can make sure that we've help children to learn about each part. So the speech sound, every spoken language has a set of speech sounds, a different set of speech sounds. So Te Reo Māori has got 20 speech sounds. English has got about 44. Other languages have fewer than that, and a couple of languages have even more sounds than English does. But we need children to become aware of those individual phonemes in order for them to be able to learn the phonics. The phonics can't stick if the children can't isolate and segment and blend those individual speech sounds, and that's called phonemic awareness. We need to teach children the spelling patterns and the letters that represent the phonemes of a language, and what the rules are about forming words in a way that conforms to the writing rules of the language. So those rules are called the orthography of a language. Every written language has its own orthography. So orthos means straight and correct. If you think an orthodontist is the person who makes your teeth straight, dont is teeth or dent is teeth, and ortho is straight. And an orthopedic surgeon is the person who makes your bones straight if you go and break them. And we also need to teach them, really explicitly with plenty of practice and feedback, how to form those letters by hand. And there will always be a critical need to teach handwriting, even though, yes, the world's moving to more and more technology, because physically forming those letter shapes seems to help the brain form that special reading and writing circuit. Maybe it supports the brain to recognize those letter shapes as well, but it is definitely a very important part. And so if handwriting has fallen by the wayside, it's really important that we bring that back. It's just a little bit every day, but it's important that children become very accurate with their letter formation and very fluent. That's going to support their reading and spelling. Not even just, you'd think it would just be about decoding and encoding words, but Steve Graham has a study that shows that children's fluency with handwriting impacts on the quality and quantity of their writing when they're in year 4 and 5. So it impacts on their word choice, the kind of complexity of vocabulary they use, and how complex their sentence structures are, all back to handwriting. And that's to do with cognitive load. If you are having to think about how to form letters, you don't have much thinking space left over to think about your ideas for writing and keeping them in order and then picking good words. And then you have to think about how to form the letter or how to spell a word, and all your good ideas go out the window. And instead of writing the word blustery, you might just choose windy in your writing. Okay, another layer that we need to be intentional about is the words of the language. So we can look at etymology. That's where words come from in time and history, whether they come from the ancient Greeks or the Romans who spoke Latin, or the Vikings or the Old English. The morphology, those meaningful word parts, base words and prefixes and suffixes. And we need to build that vocabulary to make it really broad and really deep, so kids have a really strong interconnected understanding of how words are related to each other. Every language has a specific sentence structure, so that's called syntax and grammar, so the allowable order of words and how we can make sentences more complex. And if we teach children to compose more complex sentences, so for example, starting with a where detail, so it might have been, I wouldn't generally say to you in everyday talking, oh, in a vineyard in Hawke's Bay, my cousin married the love of her life in February. I wouldn't start like that, but in writing I might, and it would make my writing more interesting. But even in books for young children, we see that kind of complicated sentence structure, starting with a preposition or a when detail. If we teach those through writing, then we know we're going to support children to process better and comprehend those more complicated sentence structures in writing when they are reading. So reading supports writing. Writing supports reading very strongly, and spelling supports reading strongly more than reading supports spelling. You can't get a whole lot better at spelling just through reading, but you can get better at reading through doing lots of spelling. Okay, and finally, the upper level of language is this discourse level. So that's anything more than a sentence. So that covers you all listening to us speaking now, and we're speaking in sentences which relate to each other in order, as well as in writing, so paragraph level and text level, and understanding those different genres and text structures. So we're teaching those for reading, writing, speaking, and listening, all of these layers of language. But we don't need to teach these all separately in our literacy block. So that's why I want to show you what a block might look like. And the principles of structured literacy are that we want to be building at all of these levels children's accuracy, so their strong knowledge and memory for all of these parts, their automaticity, so that they can retrieve all of that knowledge effortlessly, so that they've got plenty of thinking space left over to understand what they're reading or to compose and craft their ideas in writing, and fluency. So that's sort of a combination of accuracy and that speed and automaticity. And also we're going to use at all times really sensitive, really solid assessment tools. They don't need to be ones that are very time consuming. They can be, actually, many of them are as brief as 1 minute, to inform our teaching and be really responsive to the kids in front of us. Those are all the parts that we would include in structured literacy, a comprehensive approach. But if we talk about it in a block, should I move on to that? What does it look like in practice?
Yes. Yeah, please. I think that would be really interesting.
All right.
And really useful.
Cool. So let's imagine that we have maybe a year 3 classroom. So that would be, so year 3 or 4. Let's call it year 3 in New Zealand or Australia. That's fairly similar approach. So these kids would have, hopefully if they've had the first 2 or 3 years where they've had a really solid focus on helping them crack that written code, how to read and spell words using their phonics and morphology knowledge, and an equally strong focus on building knowledge about the world and lots of vocabulary and building their sentence structures. Your literacy time might look something like this. So let's talk about maybe having a 2-hour allocation to literacy a day. Would that be fair? Yep. Actually, in New Zealand, that's what we've been told we have to do. We have to have an hour on reading and an hour on writing, and everyone in New Zealand's got lots to say about that. But I think that's pretty fair, as long as it's happening. Kids need that, because reading and writing are complicated things. And actually, the way we can manage all of these parts is to integrate and synthesize multiple components in one part of your lesson. All of those bits don't need to be a separate timetabled slot in your day, and in fact you'll never get through it all if it is. So you might have about a 30-minute whole class lesson where you are reviewing previously taught alphabetic code knowledge and morphology, so things that you've learned yesterday, last week, last month, last year, and you might be teaching a new pattern. So it might be looking at the base word struct, like structure, construct, construction, if it was a morphology lesson, or you might be looking at a more advanced phonics pattern like EIGH representing the long A sound in 8, and sleigh and neigh, like a horse. And during that lesson, the kids would have a lot of opportunities to practice reading and spelling words and sentences and connected text with those particular patterns in them. And then another half an hour, you might do some small group differentiation, because both whole class teaching and differentiation are really important. The whole class teaching is important to make sure everybody is accessing the learning and getting and moving along through the learning scope and sequence, and the differentiation is important to keep children up and to extend those who need it. So instead of organising those groups by reading book level, like we would have done on a running record, and said, right, you're an orange reader or you're a level 25 reader, so my level 25 kids are coming to me in that group. We're going to organise our groups by the skills that those children need to keep their reading and writing moving forward. So it might be you've got a short group that need just some really intensive work on that phonemic awareness and some decoding and encoding at an earlier part of that scope and sequence that might have come from a few years before. Or you might have a group of 4 children who they've got that alphabetic code down. They can use the phonics to decode, but they're really having trouble making the leap into multi-syllable words. And so you're going to pull a group that's just like a multi-syllable word reading and spelling group. You're going to teach them how to use morphology and syllables to crack into those longer words to support their reading fluency and their writing. You might have a group who, although you're doing daily work where the class is practicing and developing their reading fluency, they're still reading in a really monotone way and they're not attending to punctuation to put an expression in. So you might have a little group of 5 children or 2 children who you're going to work on that phrasing. So for 6 minutes, 3 or 4 times a week, you're going to bring them in, and over a couple of weeks, see if you can really shift that and help them move forward with their fluency. And then you might have another group where they are reading Harry Potter and they need some extension. So maybe 2 or 3 times a week, you're bringing them to work through a book study with those kids to really help them keep moving forward, or some more morphology and vocabulary sort of work, or some more advanced writing. So that's 30 minutes whole class foundation skills, 30 minutes of small group differentiation based on skills identified through your assessment tools. I would do maybe 10 minutes of explicit handwriting teaching, or maybe starting to bring in some touch typing, maybe year 4, 5. Because in the same way that having to stop and think about how to form letters will hold up your writing composition and getting things down on paper, having to hunt and peck for the letters on a keyboard will also completely block up that limited working memory space that you have and stop you being able to hold your ideas in mind. And then you have about 50 minutes left. So I would then be looking to all those other parts of building language and background knowledge for comprehension and composition. And so this needs to be for everybody. That's equitable and ethical teaching. So one of the other problems of how we were using book levels to arrange our guided reading groups was that children were reading material that was far below their age and cognitive development level. They're not being exposed to more age-appropriate or challenging ideas and themes and vocabulary, not getting the discussion about those things that their peers are, simply because they don't yet have the decoding skills. So, and I think once we think about that, it becomes instantly obvious that that's not equitable. That's streaming. If we're looking at building knowledge and vocabulary and the opportunity to discuss really meaty themes in learning, that needs to be for everybody. And so I would do some whole class reading where it might be we're not differentiating the text, we're using age appropriate or challenging text, and we're helping everybody access that text by differentiating our support, not by changing the text. So you pick really high quality literature, really decent nonfiction, poems, and you can use some techniques like teacher model. So the teacher reads it first, class choral reading. Next step down would be echo reading. Teacher reads a sentence, class, they've all got the text in front of them. Class repeats the sentence back while they're reading it. So they've just heard you model it, they get to read it back. Choral reading, where everybody reads it at once. And buddy reading, where they would read the text aloud to each other, and you can teach the students to give each other error correction and feedback. And Dr. Matthew Burns talks about how even 7-year-olds can do that with just as high effect as a teacher can. So if we can get kids practicing their reading out loud in these partners with these routines, the kids can help each other improve in reading. So they've got into this text, and then as you go, you are teaching and thinking aloud and teaching the children those reading comprehension strategies in service of reading really worthy text that's going to further their learning, social, emotional, cultural, information, science, information about the world as they're going. So that part of the reading block can be related to your inquiry topic or your history topic that you're doing. It could be about flight. It could be about the water cycle. It could be about erosion. It could be something that helps the children understand the class novel that you're reading them. And then that rolls really nicely into teaching writing, because now we're building up we're layering kids' knowledge. They've got heaps they want to say because they're building real expertise in a topic, especially when we read multiple texts in one topic. They're called a text set, and that's another evidence-based way to build knowledge and also build reading comprehension and fluency. So then you can teach sentence level writing and paragraph writing in response to what they're reading. So if it's about a narrative, you might be writing a paragraph about how a character changed from the beginning to the end of the story. Like, how did the Grinch explain how the Grinch changed and what caused him to change his ways through the story? Or it might be describe some ways that octopuses can defend themselves. So you're talking about animal adaptations. And then you teach them how to form great sentences and arrange their ideas into a text. So you've really hit some of your content area teaching as well as fluency, comprehension, writing composition in your literacy block, which might mean you can go out for a game of Full Rush after lunch instead of having to do your history after lunch because you've already done it.
Yeah. So, Emma, let's say I'm a teacher and I have listened to this really amazing podcast called The Future of Learning, and I want to start implementing structured literacy. How can teachers create a classroom environment that fosters structured literacy principles?
Mm-hmm. Okay. So ideally, it would be a whole school approach, and it needs to come from both the bottom up. Teachers are becoming more and more interested in tapping into this really powerful body of knowledge that's informed by research, but also it needs to be supported and led by leadership. And that can be peer leadership, but also the school leadership needs to support system level change and support, planning out how we might choose and adopt new assessments that are going to inform our teaching change. But if you're on your own, there are still a huge number of supports that we can access. So my advice would be to try and take the change one step at a time, because you're probably already feeling, if this is very new, if this is the first time you're hearing it, you think, well, that's incredibly overwhelming. That's a huge amount of knowledge and upskilling that I might need to do. You just want to take one step at a time, eat the elephant one bite at a time. So using assessments, you want to try and identify the most pressing needs of your class And in most cases at the moment, we're finding, 70% of a class will need extra support. So in that case, we can't fix that problem by pulling kids out in small groups. This is a whole class need. So we identify a most pressing area of need, and it might be one of these things. It might be that decoding and encoding level, so really building on phonemic awareness and phonics for reading and spelling, and focus on that area. Don't forget about the language and the reading and the discussion and the building the knowledge and vocabulary. That's equally important. So you're not going to spend your whole literacy block doing the decoding, but focus on upskilling yourself and implementing high leverage practices in just that area, and just change that part of your program, and keep monitoring for the effect of that change, and keep learning. It might be that reading and spelling multisyllable words might be an area where you could really focus on learning about. In many cases, I would suggest that if you're in a year 3 or 4 or higher classroom, reading fluency is going to be an area that is going to be a massive issue for much of the class. If children are not able to read accurately and quickly and with expression, they are unlikely to be able to comprehend the text. And so our current comprehension assessments might show low comprehension, but actually when we go and measure reading fluency, it's actually a fluency problem for the majority of our kids. And we work on the fluency, and you can get very quick shifts in improving fluency. It's very exciting work for teachers and students, and you'll see an instant lovely bump in comprehension. And if people are interested, I recently did a series of two-part webinar series for Lifting Literacy Aotearoa, and there's the 2 hour-and-a-half sessions people can go and watch and learn from. And then there's a whole folder full of resources to help them implement. So the first session is about assessing reading fluency using a 1-minute per student assessment. That's highly researched and evidence-based and very sensitive and accurate. And then the second session is all about, okay, so I've done that part and my kids need help with fluency. What can I do? And there's really practical examples and lots of resources you can access for that. Is the most pressing need that oral language and vocabulary and sentence structure? Okay, do some learning about that. What are some practical things you can put in place there? Or is it writing composition at the sentence level or the paragraph level or the text level that you want to focus on first? So just, Pamela Snow talks about renovating the house, the literacy house, and just work on one room at a time. We can't live in a house where everything's been demolished and all the walls have been knocked out. You need to just work on the kitchen and, set it up in the other room for a little while. Otherwise, it's just not going to fly, and you're going to give up on it and probably move out.
That's a great analogy. So looking into the future and your experience, how do you see the structural literacy evolving in the future of education?
It's been really exciting the last, I want to say 4 years in particular, as this knowledge gets out of the pages of academic research journals, and which you couldn't access once you finish university. It's all behind paywalls. It's getting out off the pages of journals and into the hands of the people that need it the most, which is our teachers. It's all become enormously accessible. So that's a really exciting change, is that we can actually access the experts that wrote our textbooks and the experts who did that research, who want to explain it in a way that enables people to put it into practice. So there's never been a time when we have so much. In fact, it's overwhelming. There's so much great free learning to be had. But it's just lovely to see how teachers are just becoming more aware of this powerful research, and not just into reading and writing, but also to how people learn in general. So the science of learning is a whole nother body of research that's really exciting when you start to dig into it and put it into practice. How that spills over into helping us better manage our classrooms and create those safe and really effective learning environments. It's exciting to see the principles of explicit instructions spilling over into other curriculum or all the curriculum areas. So once you learn maybe structured literacy, you start to see that, well, heck, maths is a human invented skill as well. And that goes a whole lot better if we teach it in a logical, cumulative way, and we make sure that we model and provide guided practice for children with prompt feedback, and we give them chances to practice it independently to automaticity and mastery. That works too. And into science and into history. It's exciting seeing much more powerful and useful assessments being used in literacy to find out how our children's literacy is progressing. And I just want to share an example of that is the DIBBLES assessment, or any curriculum-based measurements, which are much faster than running records and long comprehension assessments, which aren't actually measuring what we thought they were measuring, because comprehension is such a complex outcome of so many other skills that we're missing important pieces of the puzzle, and we're not then focusing on the right teaching. So DIBBLES is one example of curriculum-based measurement, so the dynamic indicators of basic early literacy skills. Most of those parts of that test take 1 minute. So finding out how we can shift from less useful tools like running records to the sort of tools that give us the information that we can apply in our teaching the next day. And it's nice seeing teachers start to use those assessments as really exciting data that they can see a shift in, rather than we're doing assessments because it's reporting time and we've got to get those numbers to stick into the reporting system to send it home to the parents, and then we're done with it. And it's a horrible couple of weeks.
Yeah.
You know what I mean, don't you? Yeah.
I was just going to say that if any teachers were on the fence whether to jump onto the structural literacy bandwagon right now or not, was the 1 minute assessment.
Yeah.
I think you should sold it to everyone.
100%.
That's not 1 minute in total, but definitely all the parts of it. It's still under 10 minutes per child 3 times a year for those universal screening and progress monitoring measures. And they're just so informative. Yep. And then finally, I think the exciting thing in the future will be, when we're getting this right and we don't have so many kids not getting across the bridge anymore, we'll be so much more able to teach those other curriculum content areas, in middle and upper primary and secondary school, because the students can actually read and write to learn and engage with the content of those learning areas. So, we've got a massive bit of a major panic going on in secondary schools because the kids are arriving not able to do that. And after 8 or 10,000 hours of primary and intermediate schooling, they should be able to expect that their kids can do that. And I'm just so looking forward to a time when that is the case again.
It's coming.
It's coming.
The change is coming.
Yeah, it is. It is. That's awesome. Thanks for sharing those. And maybe as a way to wrap things up, if you can just share some resources for people to go to.
Yes, fantastic. So I would like to give you sort of a list you can share with people of some really great places to go.
We'll put this in the show notes on the description.
Yeah. And as I said, there's just never been a better time to learn. And our learners have never needed us to do this work more than they do right now. And there's just so many positive supports available to us, whether you're doing it as a whole team or a group of you or just on your own as a lone wolf. So find your people. There's so many groups online where you can find like-minded people who are also maybe just starting or they're a bit further along on their journey who will be there to answer questions. So there's there are hundreds of brilliant social media groups where you can join in and learn along with other people and ask questions. There's the 5 from 5 website, Australian-based website, which has got really accessible, not too long, but just the right amount of information for each part of all of these components of literacy that's very readable and actionable, and organised in a really easy to find way. There's the New South Wales Literacy Hub, which has got free PD sessions and learning and a few resources as well to support shift. I'm going to link to several incredible not-for-profit organisations that record and share really high-quality professional learning through webinars, like the AIM Symposium and the Pennsylvania Assistance and Technical Support Network, Pattern, the Reading League from the States, International Dyslexia Association, Lifting Literacy Aotearoa. So I've got a lovely big long list of places people can go. But as I said, just take it slowly, because
Awesome.
You'll get drowned in the waterfall of available information otherwise.
Awesome. That's great. And thank you again for coming on, and you certainly opened my eyes to the breadth and the width of structured literacy, and having been through one of these PDs that my school had tried, started a few years ago, certainly only saw a slither of the full scope, which is, probably not unsurprising. So thank you for coming on and just sharing that. It's a lot more to it, and I'm quite excited to see what's out there and to jump into it.
Awesome. Thanks, Ewan.
Yes, I just want to add to that, Emma, that after having done a little bit of work with you in my previous school, it's just amazing to see the passion that you have. So I just wish you well in your quest for continuing to make change and impact in thousands of lives. Thanks very much, Emma. All the best, and hopefully we'll be in touch soon and we can continue to discuss this in the future.
Thanks very much, Marcelo. Thanks very much for inviting me on, guys. It was lovely chatting with you.